Cuba's efforts to play a major role in third world affairs, the Cuban government of Fidel Castro directly involved itself with military and diplomatic efforts on behalf of several African socialist movements. Cuba's ties to Africa, however, also heightened tensions and oppositions to those movements and increased Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Cuban interest in Africa and anti-colonial movements began as soon as Fidel Castro came to power. Cuba sent military and medical supplies to the Algerian National Liberation Front, and upon achievement of Algerian independence in 1962, Castro established a Cuban military mission and medical mission in Algeria. He sent a similar mission to Guyana in 1961 as well, not Caribbean Guyana, British Guyana, Gold Coast Guyana, right? More substantial involvement in African affairs began in 1964, when Ernesto Che Guevara visited the leaders of the progressive movements of the Portuguese colonies, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and New Guinea. Guinea-Bissau, somewhere else in Africa. A year later, Cuba began sending military missions to Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and I'm re-recording this, but I forgot the fourth country in Africa that Portugal owns, so look that for yourself. The main recipient of the Cuban military assistance was the Angolan Popular Movement of Liberation, or the MPLA. Although there were other several revolutionary movements in Angola at the time, the MPLA received Cuban support because of its socialist ideology, most closely reflected that of the Cuban Revolution, whereas others emphasized tribalism, racism, or were just pro-Western enough. Cuba's support for African socialist movements in the early 1960s began to replace the declining Soviet aid to those movements, and Cuba was openly critical of the USSR for its failure to offer more assistance to these fledgling communist nations. This point of contention even hindered Cuban-Soviet relations for a number of years. The support of other Cold War players and Cold War governments for different Angolan movements prompted Cuba and the USSR to reconcile their differences and unite in support of the MPLA. The United States, China, and South Africa supported the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, and the Liberation Front of Angola, or the FNLA. Although the United States charged that the Soviets were dictating Cuban actions in Angola, scholarly research on the subject suggests that Cubans were largely acting on their own behalf and initiating aid to MPLA in the beginning in the first place. Cuban involvement intensified after the breakdown of peace negotiations in Portugal in 1975. As fighting escalated, Cuba sent 230 military instructors to the MPLA. South Africa, meanwhile, began to train the FNLA and UNITA troops in Namibia. When the troops of UNITA and the FNLA failed to make consequential gains against the MPLA, South African forces intervened directly. South Africa sought to maintain the instability in the region, which it hoped would guarantee the continued economic dependence on Southern Africa and Southern African nations on South Africa. South Africa was also encouraging the United States. With strong anti-communist rhetoric, South Africa cited the presence of Cuban troops as the grounds for both delaying Namibian independence and the referendum, and for continuing the policy of apartheid. So direct South African intervention in Angola, or the Bush War, changed the scope of the struggle there. It prompted the Organization of African Unity, or the OAU, immediately to condemn South Africa while simultaneously avoiding to judge others like the Cubans or the Soviets. Nigeria was a strong protester against this and against South Africa, combined with the praise of the Soviets and the Cuban actions in Angola, demonstrated that the struggle embodied more than just communism, capitalism, East and West competition, and above all, African people, both white and black. At an international level as well, Nigeria had been one of the West's strongest allies in sub-Saharan Africa and since the early days of the Cold War. But here it sided with the anti-colonialism and against racist South Africa. Cuban military aid and East Germans, like we did in the last episode, was crucial to the MPLA and their victory. By March 1976, some 24,000 Cuban troops were in Angola, a number that grew to almost 40,000 by 1984. George Orwell, your time to shine. With this assistance, the MPLA drove the South African forces out of Angola temporarily to the border No wait, this is the border war, not the bush. So negotiations over Namibian independence was complicated, and it complicated the issue. Namibia, or Southwest Africa before 1968, had been mandated by South Africa following Germany's defeat in World War I and South Africa's invasion of German Southwest. After World War II, South Africa had expanded its apartheid policies into the territory of Southwest, refusing to allow the United Nations to monitor its administration of the area. Although the United States nullified South African jurisdiction in 1966, resolutions on the dispute came very slowly. In the negotiations, South Africa linked Namibian independence to Cuban withdrawal from Angola. The Cubans, however, were unwilling to give South Africa the strategic, geopolitical, and geographic advantage that the removal of Cuban troops would actually cause. Moreover, as J.R. Brigid pointed out, Cuba insisted that the withdrawal be conducted in a way that emphasized the positive legacy of Cuban influence in African history. In 1988, a number of accords involving Cuba, Angola, Namibia, and South Africa were signed, with Cuba and Angola agreeing to remove both Cuban troops by July 1991. While West Africa got all the attention, East Africa was aight. Cuba's presence in Mozambique was more subdued than their western counterpart, involving themselves in the mid-1980s as opposed to the mid-1970s, with 700 Cuban military and 70 civilian personnel in Mozambique for the entirety of the war. While Cuba's presence in Angola was vital for the shifting balance of power in Southwest Africa, its presence in Mozambique was relatively insignificant. In Ethiopia, the Cubans also played a role. Closely in concert with the Soviet policy of keeping all the Africans in line. Before 1974, both the USSR and Cuba had supported Ethiopia's adversary, Somalia. But in that same year, Ethiopia was suffering from much internal turmoil and class struggle, and began to move towards the left. After Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974, a bitter military struggle led to the victory of the socialist faction of Tuareg in 1977. Meanwhile, Cuban former ally Somalia sponsored a revolution on the grounds of the Ogaden, which had been historically part of Ethiopia, a part of the Ethiopian Empire and Ethiopia of the state. As Ethiopia reshuffled its internal alliances, Somalia found itself on the outside and ready to strike at this vulnerable prey. Somalia smelled something in the air. Yes, it smelled a chance to attack. And Somalia found itself on the other side, ready to take the Ogaden. Only 2 months after supplying aid to Somalia in 1977, Cuba, with the collaboration with Soviet policy, began sending arms and advisors to Ethiopia. After unproductive negotiations, Somalia broke relations with Cuba and the communist world except Romania, because who doesn't like Nicolae Ceausescu? Cuba responded by sending 70,000 troops into the war-torn Ethiopia, which by 1987 had established a Marxist-Leninist state, which was already suffering from massive economic and social devastation, but was now exacerbated by a famine and drought. The end of the Cold War resulted in foreign withdrawal from the area, leading Ethiopia, Somalia, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique to struggle with the internal strife and continued economic and physical hardships that the Cold War has brought to every continent. Although Cuba's presence in Africa was beneficial to Angola and Ethiopia, and several other nations that didn't lean directly to the left, but weren't actually pro-Western as well, there was a high cost of life and material for all sides. Civil war, Cubans that will never see Havana again, and of course, the egos of the pro-West were strengthened just a little bit by their neighbor in the backyard. Cuba had both gains and losses from its interventions in Africa. It greatly strengthened its ties to the Soviet Union after it broke them off because of Africa in the first place, while further alienated the United States at the time when the willingness to normalize Cuban-US relationships had just begun under President Kennedy, actually, of all people. Well, it was the 1980s, wasn't it? Yeah, that one makes sense. I just wanted to make it lighthearted because, in effect, it furthered Cuba's break of the West, solidifying its membership of the Soviet economic and political bloc. But when that bloc came crashing down, oh wait, we're not at the end yet. Cuba's relationship with Africa and relations with Africa changed after the disintegration and the deintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. Without Soviet support, Cuba entered an extended economic crisis in the 1990s and the early 21st century, and it consequently dramatically lessened its influence and involvement in pretty much the world. Despite its difficulties, Cuba did continue to send doctors and medical missions. In 2002, Cuba had more than 20,000 physicians working on more than 200 numerous projects throughout the continent and throughout the world. And so, my friends, it's a tale of good fortune. It's a tale of sombreros. And it's a tale of the Cubans in Africa. I know that's more of a Mexican stereotype, but anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed. I don't know if I was too fast or too slow, but I would give it another go. I'll give it another go, and if I get tired of that, I can always go to something else. But anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. The bit is a bit rough because, of course, I'm not warming up. But you know what? Let me just do the front like that. But where did I really stop, though? I guess by Mozambique I should be good. Yeah, by Mozambique started leveling out. So anyway, guys, meta moment aside, stay safe, wash your ass, wear a mask, stay safe in the streets, and remember, watch my videos in the sheets. Learn something. Well, this is gonna continue for me, but it's the end for you guys. GG, amigos. Cuadrencho learno. Something like that. Like, I'll do the Spanish thing. Wait, hold on. Aprende algo, mi amigos. Muchachos. Vámonos. Adiós.